I think the people that are doing the most damage after dark don't have a political motivation at all, and a tenuous connection at best to the events in Minnesota. On the other hand, I think it's what President Trump has been up to is what's driving massive protests that we're seeing, particularly now, late in the afternoon on the west coast of the United States, this afternoon in the United States. So I think it's two different motivations for two different crowds of people.
Yeah, I guess some of the looting, I mean, the pictures from New York are just extraordinary. It was utterly mindless and nothing to do with the protests, as you mentioned. Donald Trump, I mean, it's just hard to digest what's happening this week so quickly with things moving. Between that address, the number of threats sort of littered through it, but the key one was bringing in the military. Fascinating. The Defence Secretary Esper is now saying he doesn't agree with this. But what does that mean in this Trump regime? Does this just mean he's headed for the exit pretty soon?
That is certainly the speculation, and indeed Esper, there's a bit of a whipsaw going on. Elements of the 82nd Airborne that had been deployed largely in a standby role for the Washington, D.C. area. Esper said he didn't agree with that. There were orders to send them back to their bases. Literally hours later, just in the last couple of hours, that order has been countermanded. They are staying in the D.C. area. A lot of speculation about what Esper's status is. The fact that General Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, Esper's immediate predecessor, has been so forceful, coming off the sidelines, harshly critical of Trump. I think it highlights, Tom, sort of this, great discomfort that the military has with being deployed on the American homeland in almost any circumstances, but particularly for so-called law and order operations.
I mean, the comments, those ones from Mattis, it just sort of goes to the fact that almost nobody outside of the Trump regime that was once inside comes out and continues with what they were saying before, that the only way that people are sticking to the script and saying that Donald Trump is doing the right thing in a lot of these areas, in particular what's happening right now, is because they're still bound through some sort of current loyalty.
There is a lot of courage after the fact. I think that's a fair comment. I'd also point out that there is a pretty heavy turnover, and that a lot of these people who the funny thing, Tom, would be that on the way in you'd go, wow, that is a very aggressive, Mad Dog Mattis was his name. Yeah. And I remember people going, Kelly, the former secretary, chief of staff rather, at the time you're going in, you think they're quite audacious, bold picks that will be a good match for Trump, and very muscular sort of people, particularly in their approach.
Right? This is what's always assumed, that they'd right. Never just sort of back down or let Donald Trump, have his way. They'd be speaking out while they're within the White House administration.
McMaster, the same sort of characters, but a lot of people finding that courage. I think well after the fact. I think the thing that a lot of people are looking for, these people that are willing to go on background, senior White House sources saying they're appalled with what's been happening, but not prepared to resign on the spot. But finding, I think, when the inevitable comes and they part ways with the Trump White House, some months later, finding the time and the opportunity to speak out. Yeah.
Courage after the fact, that's a much better way of putting it than I garbled through there. What about the country in the future, Simon Jackman, and where we're looking? Because yes, it appears that the country right now quite clearly is more divided. Now, this event wasn't started by Donald Trump, but clearly the fans have been flamed. The question is, what happens, first of all, if Donald Trump wins? I mean, is this a rolling situation for 4 years? But even if Joe Biden wins, I mean, will we see Trump supporters marching on the streets? He's alluded at the last election to whether or not a result should be believed. We've got increased armed militias on the right and the left in America.
Yeah, Tom. So I think this is the concern that I personally, as a scholar of American politics, have, and a lot of my colleagues out at the US Study Center. Something we have the events that we're all reacting to over the last couple of days, but I think the question a lot of us are asking, what does this portend for the prospects for a free, fair, and peaceful election, and if necessary, transfer of power? And I've, never been more pessimistic about the prospects for that in an American election. But these are the tests of what it means to be a democratic regime. Can you hold a process, an election, to determine who shall hold the reins of national power? And if there is a change in who holds those reins, can that transfer be done peacefully? That is what it means to be a democracy. And for the first time in my adult life, I find myself having a question as a scholar, as a professor, with my colleagues about that proposition about what it means to be a democracy is under, one can't help but ask the question in a very serious way, is that going to happen this time around in the United States of America? It's a remarkable question that we find ourselves asking.
Because that's the same question we so often ask in, countries where there might have been an actual dictator in place, a quasi-dictator, countries that are relatively new to democracy. They're the questions we always ask. There's the election, what happens? I don't think we're in the sort of similar territory as in, who does the military have loyalty and that sort of thing, but it's the fabric of society instead we're talking about that might crumble.
And that's right. I think the threat to a free and fair election in the United States does have this element to it. David Kilcullen wrote a fascinating piece in the Australian over the weekend, a long, detailed accounting almost of groups on the left and the right in the United States that potentially pose this sort of threat coming up from society itself to a free and fair election. I commend it to viewers to go dig that up on the Australian's website if you've got access to it. And I think that's a significant driver of the concern. I think a lot of us feel, and you're absolutely right. This is the sort of the question that we would more typically pose to a regime going through what we call democratic consolidation, that is a bit iffy about its commitment to democracy. On the other hand, Tom, I actually think it is in American civil society where those commitments to democratic norms are so strong that I think at the end of the day will ultimately be the backstopping that where we look back on this election and we say it was a reasonably free and fair election. That will be up to, in huge measure, to ordinary American men and women. And I remain confident, frankly, in their resolve to see that we do have a free and fair election in November.